The 350Z, the Mustang, and the WRX are all three platforms that are very, very popular, and a lot of people, surprisingly, even though they're very different, end up cross-shopping them for a new vehicle. I've actually owned all of these, so I'd like to give my insight on what would be the best choice for you if you're considering one of these vehicles. Let's go. First, we need to fill up the Mustang though, because it is very low on fuel, so let's go ahead and start her up and get it going. I do very much love how this car sounds. How could you not? Also, totally unrelated note, it's warm enough today to finally drive with the windows down, which is so awesome because I absolutely love driving with the windows down, especially when you have a nice sounding car and just hearing it reverberate and bounce off of the walls and stuff you're driving by. Good stuff. Also, we got pretty peak lighting right now, but that means we don't have a lot of time, so let's go. I know technically a touch wash like this is actually bad for your vehicle's paint in a lot of cases, but since I haven't gotten the chance to give this car a full detail yet, plus right now it's winter anyway, it's really satisfying. I don't know, it's temporarily worth it. Like I said, it's really warm out today, but still, look at all of the salt on the ground. Look at over there. Jeez. And people wonder why Midwest cars rust. I mean, good Lord. So I figured the best way that we could discuss this topic was by basically going through a pros and cons list of each platform, as it were, and essentially talk about what might make each platform the best for you depending on what you are planning to do with the car. And I do think that it's important to know I have owned all of these vehicles. I will go through these in the order that I owned them, which was 350Z, WRX, then Mustang. And not only did I own them, I was also very actively involved in researching the aftermarket department at like any given moment for these cars. I always do a ton of research on a platform before I buy it, and I'm assuming you probably do also, which is how you found this video. And or you just watch my channel, in which case, thank you. Let's get into it. We're also gonna cover some rumors and truths about each platform as well, and basically try to make this as objective and realistic as we possibly can, because like I said, I have owned all these cars and I have really enjoyed all these cars. So starting with the 350Z and starting with the pros, first of all, the 350Z has a really, really good chassis design. Even stock, they handle very, very well overall. They're not the lightest cars of all time, but they are still decently light, especially in comparison to a lot of modern day cars. And they just generally handle really well. The chassis is fairly rigid, and it does not take much to make them a rock solid, very sharp and aggressive handling vehicle. And on that same note, the next pro is basically that the suspensions are very simple and easily upgradable. One thing you can do to 350Zs is that you can upgrade to a true dual rear coilover. I say upgrade, I don't know if that's the right term technically, but from the factory they have a separate strut from a separate spring in a spring bucket, and if you literally just get one complete unit, you can mount it to the normal spot where the strut would mount, replace that spring bucket with what I believe becomes a tow arm, and that suspension is lighter, and it's, you know, it's a nice setup. That's something that's easy to do. Like I said, aftermarket support for these cars is everywhere, and there are a ton of different options for suspension for basically anything that you'd want to do, whether it be slamming it to the ground on bags or racing it every single weekend with the most precision that you possibly can. The next pro is that it's a very reliable power plant, especially when NA and with minor upgrades. These cars just don't really break. The power plant is really, really good. And that's something that I don't think that is really like mentioned enough with 350Zs to an extent, is that if you leave them stock or close to it, essentially just naturally aspirated instead of going forced induction, these cars are very reliable and they are very fun with the stock amount of power. They're not the fastest cars in the world, but they're certainly not bad. The next huge pro is that the transmissions on 350Zs are known to be super stout even when boosted. The CD09 and CD00A are both transmissions that are used in the 350Z depending on the year range, and are even used in a lot of different engine swaps and stuff like that because they do hold power so well, and they also have a great shifter feel. My 350Z with the stock shifter is still one of my favorite shifters that I have ever experienced in any car. It definitely blows the stock Mustang shifter out of the water. One transmission that's not mentioned as much with the 350Zs is the very early ones that was in the DE cars. Well, the earlier DE cars, 03, 04, and I think 05, which is the CD008 or CD08. I can't remember which one it is off the top of my head. And that is a very decent transmission as well. It's not that different from the others. They were known to occasionally have issues with like third gear synchros or occasionally some other synchros and stuff like that. If you're buying the car, just make sure that the transmission is shifting well, it doesn't have any weird pop outs or lockouts, and you're probably good. That transmission alone will hold a lot of power as well. The next pro is that the stock transmission is actually very responsive and has a nice flat power curve and torque band, essentially. Basically anywhere you are in the power band, there's usable power, which is a huge pro. There's a lot of cars, S2000, something like that comes to mind, or even like the BRZ FRS, something like that. Even the newest versions of those cars as of now in 2023, they have decent power, but you have to rev them out quite a bit to get to that top end power, whereas the power band on the 350Zs, both the DE and HR motors, is pretty linear, basically almost all the way up, and you can really feel that when you're driving it. It feels like it pulls all the way up to redline, and it's a really nice feeling. And overall, I think that around town daily driving and even on most tracks, that's plenty of power. It's not that you might ever be wanting, but it's essentially as much as you would ever realistically need, and it's always usable at any point in the power band. And the last huge pro for 350Zs, I already mentioned it briefly and I have basically covered it here and there, is that the aftermarket support is absolutely huge. You could say that for literally all of these cars. That's going to be a pro on all of them, in case you're not ready for that. But again, aftermarket support for 350Zs is huge. There's companies that specifically make parts for 350Zs, or companies that specifically supply parts for 350Zs and other Z cars. Z1 Motorsports, Concept Z Performance, the list goes on from there. Those are just two huge ones that you might think of immediately. And ultimately, these cars have support for anything that you would ever want to do with them, and that's very important. If you're looking at a platform, you don't know for sure which direction you're going to go with it. You want to know that you can cover literally any ground, and you absolutely can with the 350Z. As for the cons of the 350Z, and in this case by extension the 370Z, one thing that is definitely notable about them is that they do not tend to make power very easily while NA. You definitely can make a little bit more power than stock, but breaking 300 wheel horsepower is going to be incredibly difficult to do while NA. Typically, the best move to make power on a VQ platform in general is going to be to go forced induction. And again, it's not that it's impossible to make power with them, but for the dollar that you end up spending on trying to do like a high compression built NA engine to make any power out of it, you would have basically been better off just going forced induction and running a low amount of boost if you wanted it to be reliable anyway. The later HR motors are a little bit better when it comes to this. They can be pushed a little bit further, but either way, they're not going to be the best power builders naturally aspirated, and that's just kind of a fact of the platform. Number two, the interiors are crap-tastic. They are junk. This is a 2011 Mustang GT that the camera is sitting on right now and that you saw earlier in the video. I love this car. This interior is not exactly amazingly fantastic, but it is way better than the interior in the 350Z. All three of these cars, under basically almost any year range except for the very newest models, are not the greatest interiors known to man. That's why they're a decently affordable platform, because corners were cut in some areas where they could cut them. But the 350Z in particular, these interiors are so bad. A quote from Everyday Driver when they originally reviewed the 350Z, 370Z, and 300ZX against each other, they said that the 350Z is a car that you buy in spite of its interior, definitely not because of its interior, and that is a fact. The interior may not bother you, but if you are bothered by interiors that tend to squeak and rattle and clank around and rough, hard plastics. This is gonna be a car that you probably want to avoid. And by extension of the interior, these are just not particularly refined vehicles. When it comes to interior noise and stuff like that, road noise, it's something that you're going to notice. None of the vehicles on this list are the most refined vehicles in general. I'm sure that that's not necessarily what people are expecting, but it's still something to note. They're just not particularly refined. I don't know what other way I can put that. And the last major con that you'll notice with 350Zs, and actually a lot of Z cars in general, is that they tend to overheat when pushed for a long period of time. You see 350Zs on track days and stuff like that. If it's a 350Z that is built as a seat time car, most likely they're going to want to have oil cooling upgrades on that car. Otherwise, you are going to run into overheating issues very often. It's definitely something that is worth investing in, is basically oil cooling and just general cooling for the car at all, especially if you're going forced induction. That's not necessarily something that should keep you from the car, but it is something that should be kept in mind. Moving on to the WRX and its pros, the first pro is that the handling is genuinely impressive, even with just minor modifications. Stock, they're not bad, but a lot of WRXs tend to lean on the squishier suspension side stock, and they tend to have a little bit of body roll. But I was shocked when I bought my WRX, which was a 2008, which was in a lot of ways probably the least impressive handling WRX almost ever. I was surprised just how close handling precision wise it got to the 350Z. And they too have a ton of a lot of support for suspension and stuff like that. The suspension's very, very simple, very easily upgradable. I screwed around with the suspension on my WRX. It was a lot of fun, and so that's something of note as well. And by extension, the all-wheel drive grip is genuinely addictive. It is amazing what a difference it is. If you've only ever driven front-wheel drive or rear-wheel drive cars, or a combination of the two, and you've never had a performance-minded all-wheel drive car, it may genuinely shock you, like it shocked me, just how good the handling of an all-wheel drive vehicle is. The grip is insane. The grip just never ends. And that can be a bad thing in some ways because it gives you so much confidence. So a lot of these pros coincide because from basically the grip being incredibly addictive and impressive into they are fantastic winter vehicles. This coincides with that grip very strongly, of course. The all-wheel drive system is great for winter. It is symmetrical in most WRXs. The torque split on STIs can be adjusted with the DCD controller, which is basically just an active center diff controller. It essentially just controls how the diffs lock up and sort of the torque split of them to an extent. But no, genuinely, I on one occasion got stuck in the middle of a blizzard. I was working and I came out of a building. It was lightly snowing when I went into the building. I came out about an hour and a half later and there was literally like 4 inches of snow on the ground. My car was covered in snow. I was like, oh, this is not good. And I was on winter tires also as well. I was prepared, but it was amazing to me how I felt completely fine. The car just handled the snow like an absolute champ. I've never driven a better vehicle in the snow. I don't think I've ever even been in a better vehicle in the snow. And there was full-size half-ton, three-quarter-ton pickups that were sliding all over the road, sometimes going into ditches, while I was fine in the Subaru. And I've said this in a video before, it's amazing to me how in the snow, if you're not driving like a complete idiot, you will be absolutely fine. Even if you're driving like a slight idiot, you will still probably be fine. These cars just crush it in the snow, and there's no other way to put that. Another major pro of the WRX is that they are amazingly practical vehicles for how fun they are. You could say this about practically any performance-minded 4-door sedan or hatchback, but it is also of application here. Mine was an 08 hatch, and the amount of space that I had in this car was amazing. My wife and I used it as a cleaning vehicle, and we had all of our stuff in the back. We drive it around, and it was great for that. Really, the only thing that lets down the practicality at all is the gas mileage. Otherwise, it's about as practical of a hatchback or sedan as you can pretty much find in its category. And last, like I said, same thing for the 350Z. There is almost endless aftermarket support. For Subarus in particular, it is interesting how the amount of brands and companies that specifically focus on Subaru as their basically only focus is amazingly high. More than almost any other platform I've ever seen, there is just aftermarket support anywhere you look for Subarus. So basically anything you'd ever want to do is not an issue with a Subaru. If you're going to modify it, well, you will not have any problems doing so. As for cons with the WRX, of course, there are known faults with the engines. Subaru fans, and I am a huge Subaru fan, that's why I bought the car, there are known faults with the engine, and Subaru fans will tell you that, you know, oh, it's because of this, you know, whatever. The issue I have is people defending Subaru by pointing out faults and saying it's the fault of the owner. They should have known that that was an issue and they could have fixed it and then they wouldn't have had this problem. Well, it's not their fault that Subaru did not do something properly or in a way that they most likely should have from the factory. Now, granted, none of these things are very complicated to fix, and they're well documented things like if you're going to be driving hard on track and stuff like that, the oil pans are not good at all. They have very little baffling. They are not at all designed for hard cornering. They're essentially the same oil pans that's on, you know, an NA Subaru Outback. And then also the oil pickup tube is complete garbage as well. It is known to crack, suck basically just air into the oiling system and destroy the bearings. And this is the one Subaru thing that I'll point out, the oil pickup tube, where I'll say, really, there is not always a lot of rhyme or reason for why that happens, and that is something where if you're worried about reliability, replacing that oil pan and the oil pickup tube, like with an option from IAG, they have a lot of great options for something like that. It's $700, something like that, and will give you a lot of peace of mind for the reliability of the vehicle. I personally never did it with my WRX. I never had an issue. You might not either, but it is something to keep in mind. Another major con is that Subaru engines pretty much need to be built to make much power, and there's really no way around that. If you're wanting to make more than essentially 300, maybe 330 horsepower at the wheels reliably, you're going to need to build the engine. And if you're right on that ceiling, you're probably going to want to save to build the engine because they're not built for that sort of power. Built Subaru engines, there's plenty of options that make, you know, that are very reliable and can make a lot of power, but stock, there hasn't really been a Subaru engine from the factory that has been stout enough to take the abuse that other platforms can take power-wise with simple modifications. Subarus can build power easily, but they are not great at maintaining that power with a stock bottom end. So if you want to build big power, Subaru's probably not your greatest choice. If you're dead set on a Subaru, keep in mind you're going to need to build the engine, or you're going to need to save to build the engine after you inevitably blow it up by throwing way too much power through it. Another huge con is non-STI cars have the notoriously weak 5-speed transmission. Now, this is something that can fail even with stock cars. Now, granted, I would say when it fails on a stock car, it's probably because the owner is being a complete idiot. All-wheel drive cars, this is a weird thing that I don't know how this started in the car community. Everyone has this view that all-wheel drive cars launch so good and they're crazy good off the line. Launching an all-wheel drive car hard is horrible for the drivetrain. A rear-wheel drive car, you launch it hard, it's gonna spin the tires. That's where all that extra strain goes to. Same thing with a front-wheel drive car. An all-wheel drive car does not have that luxury. All that shock from a sudden launch goes straight into the drivetrain. And in this case, with a 5-speed that's essentially not that different from the NA 5-speeds that would be in like an Outback or a regular Impreza or whatever, in the earlier cars, they don't hold power well like that. They don't hold abuse like that well. 08 to 2014 cars do have a better 5-speed, and the 2015 and up cars do have a 6-speed. All of those are better, but the 08 to 14 cars with that 5-speed, it's still not something that's particularly strong. If you're wanting to make much over 300 horsepower at the wheels, that's also something that you're going to want to consider either building or replacing with an STI 6-speed. Also, one common myth is that the 6-speed that is... This train's gonna be the death of me. One common myth as well is that the 2015 WRX 6-speed is the same 6-speed that's in the STI. It's actually not, it's completely different. They have completely different ratios and they are of completely different construction. The construction is much more like a 5-speed transmission of the earlier cars. It's a split case as well. And internally, it is more similar to the 6-speed. I don't know the exact comparison of strength between the two, whether it is closer in strength to the 5-speed or the 6-speed, but that is just one thing to keep in mind. A lot of people were like, oh great, I can get the new WRX now, it has the 6-speed. It's not the same transmission, so I want to clear that up. One other major con is that the gas mileage is crap for the size of the engine. It's complete garbage. Granted, a lot of performance platforms have very bad gas mileage, but for a 2.5 liter 4-cylinder, the gas mileage is very bad. I average somewhere between, depending on driving, and the mostly city driving that I've done for the last several years of my life at this point, I don't know, I average something like 21, maybe, less than that in the winter. When I did mostly highway driving, I averaged around 24, 25, maybe 26, but that was pushing it. If you drive the car hard, your gas mileage is gonna be very not good for what it is. And like I said before, that's really kind of the only thing that lets down the practicality of this car is the gas mileage, and because it's turbocharged, it needs to run premium fuel. It's gonna cost you a lot in fuel. All of these cars will cost you a lot in fuel. And the last major con that I would say about Subarus is that they are genuinely more expensive to build than other platforms that are similar in price. If you want to build a straight line car, do not pick a Subaru. It is not the right choice for that. If you want to build a car that can do everything, it's a great choice for that. But bottom line, if you want to make a lot of power, I don't think the Subaru is the best choice for you. And I'm not saying that it's impossible, but if you're wanting something that you can build inexpensively, this is not the one. Okay, last car, the Mustang and the Mustang Pros. This is the car that I currently own. I do love it. I loved all of these cars. All of them were my absolute baby, and it really hurt me to get rid of the WRX and the 350Z, especially the WRX. I don't know how to explain loving Subarus because they do have problems, and if you're realistic at all, you know they have problems, but it's just, they're so fun. Number one pro of the Mustang is obvious. There is tons of usable power from the V8 models of literally pretty much any generation, especially for the time. This is what I love about Mustangs, is that almost any one of them is really easily upgradable, and you can make power fairly easily, especially for the price range that each one of them falls into. The next pro, which also coincides with that, is 2011 and up. 5.0 cars have insane power potential. Naturally aspirated, it is amazing how a few bolt-ons can get you, literally net you 100 extra horsepower at the wheels super easily. And it does not take a lot. And cars that have superchargers on them, it is amazing how with something like, headers, a full exhaust, and a decent supercharger, and that's it on a stock motor, are making like 700 wheel horsepower. That's a cheat code, man. I'm telling you, it is insane. There are other cars that also have great power potential, LS engines, but in comparison to the earlier modular V8s, this one is particularly amazing just how well it can make power. Another huge pro about Mustangs is that there is a Mustang for literally any budget. Say you want a Mustang GT and you're open-minded about it. Okay, cool. Go buy yourself a brand new Mustang GT. Can't afford a brand new Mustang GT? Okay, awesome. Buy yourself a S197 later generation like this with a 5.0, 2011 to 2014. Sweet, you'll find that car super fun too. Can't afford that? Okay, get an earlier S197 with the 4.6 with the 3-valve. You know, that's also a great car, good engine, not quite as cool as the Coyote, but still a great car, great power for the price. Can't afford that? Get an SN95 New Edge. Can't afford that? Get an earlier SN95. Can't afford that? Well, that's probably the cheapest Mustang there is right now. But the point, you know, it goes on and on and on. Can't get those? Get the V6 models of all of them if you don't care specifically about having a V8, which if you're interested in the other two cars, maybe you don't. But I mean, just for full transparency, I bought this Mustang for $16,000 and it is an incredibly fun car for that price. I did spend more on this than I spent on the WRX or the 350Z combined actually, but the amount of car you get for the price here and in literally any generation of Mustang is practically unrivaled. We're rapidly losing light, so we gotta hurry up with this. Another huge pro is that the power plants in literally any generation of Mustang are known to be incredibly long-lived. The Coyote motor, they put it in F-150s, they last forever. It's a great engine. They hold power very, very well. And you know, like I said, the modular 4.6 3 valves, those are also great engines. The earlier 2-valve versions of the same engine, they're great engines. They last a really long time. The 5.0s that you would find in the old Fox bodies, you know, those also lasted a really long time. These are all engines that are known to be very incredibly reliable. And by extension, another pro is maintenance cost is incredibly inexpensive. They put these engines in a lot of different vehicles. And beyond that, the Mustang is essentially the best-selling sports car of all time. They are everywhere, parts are everywhere, and because of that, parts are really inexpensive. And it makes cost of ownership really inexpensive, which is fantastic as well. And the last major pro, like I mentioned with the other two, aftermarket support for a Mustang is almost unrivaled. The amount of especially American brands that make parts specifically for Mustangs is crazy. And there are, you know, websites that specifically favor Mustangs over other ones that, you know, that sell a lot of different muscle car parts, including Mustangs, American Muscle, Late Model Restoration, CJ's Pony Parts. You know, all of those are just 3 huge options people would think of immediately, and there's plenty of others as well. This is a platform that you will not struggle finding parts for, pretty much regardless of what it is. As far as cons for the Mustang, pre-2015 Mustangs all have a solid rear axle, which is not by itself a bad thing, but for a car that was all the way up to 2014 having a solid rear axle, that's not great. Getting a really good handling solid rear axle car is not impossible. It's definitely doable, but it's not as great of a starting point as independent rear suspension is going to be, literally no matter what. It's great for drag racing. If you want to pick a Mustang for drag racing, solid rear axle cars are everywhere, literally from the very beginning all the way to 2014. That's a great choice, with the exception of a few different cars like the 1999 to 2004 Cobras. Those had independent rear suspension. Everyone hated it at the time, which is ridiculous because now everyone thinks it's insane that the solid rear axle lasted this long. You can't make people happy. That's what I learned. Another thing is that weight is definitely on the heavier side, not as much as you might think in comparison. This Mustang is actually not that much heavier than a 350Z. This generation weighs somewhere in the range of like 3,500 to 3,700 pounds, 3,800 maybe for certain models, and a 350Z is in the range of like 3,200 to 3,500. So it's not way off, but it is definitely weight that's there and you can notice it. So it's a con to mention. Another con is that 20 and 11 up 5.0 cars are equipped with the MT82 transmission, which is not known to be the most reliable transmission of all time. It is not as much of a concern as the 5-speed WRX. So to me, I'm not phased at all, but it's not the most reliable transmission. It's not going to be nearly as sturdy or bulletproof as the CD09 in the 350Zs or the Tremec T56, something like that. This one, it's not terrible. It can handle power okay, but it does not like to be forced very hard into gear. You do have to be careful with it. It's just something to note. Again, it's not the worst transmission ever, but it's not the best transmission in this class of car for sure. The last major con is that overall handling dynamics in general on this platform tend to be a little muted in comparison to the other two cars. It's not as bad as you might think. By this time period, by this point in history, American cars already handled fairly well. Anyone that tells you that they're a big, heavy cruise ship and they'll never be as good as something else is just being an idiot. These cars handle good, but they're not going to be quite as precise, at least stock, as the other two cars on this list. So if that's what you're looking for, it might not be the greatest choice. So to round up this whole video, let's talk about why you might want each car. I'm gonna describe you why I would choose each car and what I think would be the best choice for them. If you want to build a track or an autocross car, I think that the 350Z is a great choice. In my opinion, the 350Z is the best choice of these three for something like that. They're incredibly reliable. They have incredibly good handling. Aftermarket support is everywhere for them. People that know how to tweak these suspensions to be as precise as possible are everywhere. These cars are great for that, and they're all over track days and autocross and stuff like that. There's a good reason, because they're good for that. If you want a car that can do everything, that you want to daily drive and occasionally you might take it to the track or the drag strip, whatever it might be, but you also want something that you can drive in winter or whatever, hey, the WRX is the best choice for that. Even if you're not going to drive it in winter, in my opinion, the WRX is the most fun car on the street for day-to-day life. Sure, you might have more fun in the 350Z or the Mustang especially on the street, but neither one of those cars is going to do every other monotonous task the same way that a WRX will in day-to-day life. It's a great choice for if you want something that's a daily driver that you can also screw around with. That's what I would choose in that case. The Mustang is the best choice if you want something that is going to build power. It will build power astronomically better than the other two cars will. And when it's building power, especially going forced induction, it doesn't make it, the 350Z, the DE motor, it doesn't typically stay reliable over about 400 horsepower at the wheels with forced induction. The Subarus, the WRXs, and even the STIs, over 300 wheel horsepower with bigger turbos and stuff like that, they have a hard time remaining reliable. The 5.0s in these cars are known to stay reliable up to like 700 wheel horsepower, which is insane. Newer cars, I think, are even better than that. This is a Gen 1 Coyote, but like the Gen 3 or Gen 4 Coyotes are even more stout, and so that's a great choice. If you want to build a drag car, this is the best choice. What do I think is the worst choice for each one? If you want to build purely a track car, I don't think that the WRX is your best choice. I think the other two could potentially do that better. I'm not saying people have not done it and have done it fantastically. They definitely can. Performance-wise, I fully understand why they're going to do that. But if you have any sort of budget, I don't think that building a Subaru to be a track weapon is going to fit that budget as good as the other cars will. Worst for a drag car, I would say, is probably also the Subaru. Launching a stock Subaru on a stock diff, on a stock axles, stock transmission is not a good idea. Doing it over and over and over again is a great way to learn how quickly your paycheck can disappear for the next 3 years. So I don't think that's your greatest choice for that either. And this, again, I love Subarus. I'm a huge Subaru fan. It's one of my favorite brands of all time. But if we're being realistic, that's not your greatest choice for that either. What is the worst choice for the daily driver? In my opinion, probably the 350Z. Now, I know you could probably pick on the Mustang or the 350Z in this regard, but in my opinion, both of them can be decently comfortable cars. They're not terrible, but the Mustang has a slightly nicer interior. It has better amenities than any model year of the 350Z does. And I think just typically, it's a more comfortable car to drive long distances in and stuff like that. The cockpit's more roomy, it's slightly more practical. It does have back seats if the people you're carrying with you don't have legs or heads, but they're there. So ultimately, all of these cars are a good platform. I've owned all of them, like I said, and I loved all of them, but please keep in mind what you're going to be doing with them and what will be the best option for each way. Hopefully this video has helped you out if you are cross-shopping these cars for whatever reason, or if you're cross-shopping two of these cars, which one you think would be best. This is what I've learned from owning them. I would recommend you do your own research further as well, but I hope this helped you on your quest to find your next vehicle. And if you're watching this video just because you wanted to watch me, why? That's weird. But I appreciate it. If you guys did enjoy this video, please consider subscribing for more videos of this sort, and I will see you guys later.